So can you actually get all the benefits of fasting just by sipping on some kombucha? We're going to talk all about that and so very much more on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through yet another story chronicling the lives of the tiny and infamous, that would be, of course, the incredible and amazing, the fascinating bacteria. We're going to have a really cool conversation today about kombucha and about intermittent fasting, two, you would suspect, not linked topics, but as it turns out they are by this really neat paper that we're going to jump into in a second. Before we jump into that, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the bell for all the notifications whenever we drop a video. And if you are following us on if you are listening to us on Spotify or the Apple Podcast, don't forget to give us a follow, so that way you can stay up to date with all the cool science that we're talking about here on the podcast. Now, I guess the best way to start talking about this paper and the really cool research that is present in said paper is by talking about dieting, right? So there's a lot of different reasons why people diet. There's tons of different health benefits associated with different kinds of diets. Obviously, a lot of folks want to diet as a way to lose weight or something like this. But the main point here is that there's a lot of different diets, right? They're very diverse, right? There's obviously the keto diet. That's a famous one where you're primarily eating fats and proteins and stuff like that. There's the Mediterranean diet. There's the vegan diet where you're not using any animal products. There's the vegetarian diet, which is similar to the vegan diet in that you don't eat any meat, but I think you can use different animal products. And I think there's like a spectrum with that. So more things for me to learn. But the one that I like to use and the one that is near and dear to my heart and the one that worked best for me is intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But the first main point that I want to make here is that there's a whole bunch of different diets that are currently being used right now. I always heard that there's no like one silver bullet diet for if you want to lose weight or something like that. The one that works is the one that you want to use. The one that you can stick with is the one that you want to use, right? Now there's a whole bunch of different diets, and intermittent fasting is just one of those. Now, specifically focusing in on intermittent fasting, there's even a whole bunch of different. The general concept with intermittent fasting is kind of in the name, right? You are fasting intermittently. You get to eat for a small period of time, and then you fast for tends to be a larger period of time. Now, there's even subdivisions within the intermittent fasting universe, right? There's something called time-restricted eating. That's the way that I do it, and that is just, again, you fast for a period, and then you get to eat whatever you want for a period, right? And this ranges anywhere from like 12 and 12 of 12 hours fasting and 12 hours being able to eat to I've seen like 20 and 4, where you fast for 20 hours and then you can eat for 4 hours. I like to sit somewhere in the middle. Usually it's anywhere from it's a 16 and 8 or it's a 20 and 4. But that's one way you can do it. There's other ways you can do intermittent fasting. You can do just whole day fasts where you just fast for an entire day and then you eat on the days where you're not fasting, obviously. I've heard of some people who do 2 days a week where they do a full fast and then they just eat whatever they like for the rest of the week. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can do intermittent fasting. And as it turns out, there's a lot of different benefits associated with intermittent fasting as well. Obviously, there's tons of benefits for the different types of diets, and there's different ways that you can weigh that depending on your own needs and what you want to do. But there are some diets that seem to be linked to intermittent fasting, right? So there's a decreased incidence of cardiovascular disease whenever you're doing intermittent fasting, which is awesome. Obviously, there's the weight loss side of things. It certainly helped with my weight loss journey. There's even been some really neat research that indicates that it's associated with longevity, but I'm still developing my understanding on that, and I think that the science on that is still evolving. But one of the ways that intermittent fasting helps, right, is by rerouting and modulating lipid metabolism. So how do we treat fats in our bodies? Right? Now, one of the ways that intermittent fasting helps with this is it can bring down what people typically call the bad cholesterol or the LDLs. It's not really totally accurate, but it brings down the levels of LDLs to a more proper ratio, right? It decreases the levels of fatty acids, of fat in our actual blood, which is associated with increased incidence of health. So that's really awesome. So there's a bunch of different benefits to intermittent fasting, one of which is a better modulation of lipid metabolism, a better way of regulating how we process and consume and synthesize our fats. Okay. Now, what if you were an industrious scientist of this era and you hear that type of information, then you could be like, well, gee, intermittent fasting seems like it's a really great thing, right? But is there a way that we could have these benefits of intermittent fasting without having to do the fasting? Is there a way that we can enhance these benefits? Or for people who can't or don't want to do intermittent fasting, is there a way that we can get those similar benefits through some other type of mechanism, right? Can we bypass the actual fasting part and still get some of these awesome benefits? And that's actually what a bunch of folks over at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in North Carolina, go Tar Heels. So what they were doing is they were looking at this question: is there a way that we can get those benefits from intermittent fasting through some other mechanism? And so the way they were tackling it had to do with the microbiome, had to do with bacteria. Now, in order to jump into this, let's take a second to reemphasize the point that our gut microbiome, the bacteria that live within our gut, right, they are heavily influenced by and can influence the food and the biomolecules that we eat, right? So if I'm living on a keto diet and I'm primarily eating proteins and fats and whatnot, whenever I eat that, right, I'm encouraging the growth of bacteria that can help process those fats and those proteins, right? If I'm primarily living on a vegan diet or just a vegetable-based diet, I'm going to encourage the growth of bacteria that can help process or will thrive better when those types of biomolecules are around, right? So depending on our diet, and it's actually really cool if you look at the composition of the microbiome of the gut, depending on the different kind of diet. The main point being here is that the composition of the gut changes a lot depending on the food that we're eating. Now, what's really cool is that the microbiome can actually do some feeding back as well, right? So depending on, let's say you've eaten a whole bunch of chocolate and you've cultivated a series of bacteria in your gut, right, that really like sugar. What's really neat, and there's been really cutting edge research on this, which is super cool, is that those bacteria within the gut can signal up to your brain. And so this sugar craving that you can sometimes experience is not like, oh my gosh, it's me wanting more sugar. It's actually your bacteria and they want the sugar and they're sending it up to you, to your brain saying, hey, actually you want the sugar, right? So not only does the food that we consume, do the biomolecules that we consume modulate the bacteria, right? But those bacteria can also modulate the biomolecules we consume. So really cool research. So point number 3, our gut microbiome is influenced and can influence our own diet. Now, what these researchers were doing is they were curious, is it possible for us to grow a microbiome because it's so tied in with our metabolism? Is it possible for us to get a microbiome that gives us those benefits of intermittent fasting that we talked about, specifically about that lipid metabolism, right? Or maybe even longevity. Ooh, that'd be really cool, right? And this is where the researchers, for whatever reason, decided to bring in the topic of kombucha. Now, if you don't know what kombucha is really cool. It's a tea-based drink, right? And what you're doing is you're taking tea and a whole bunch of really sugary tea, and you're blending it with a combination of a couple different microbes, yeast, right, and bacteria. And these yeast and bacteria, they're going to process and work with the molecules that are present in the tea, and they're going to produce a couple different things. They'll produce some alcohol to a certain extent. They're going to produce CO2 to a certain extent. They're going to produce vinegar to a certain extent, all to varying degrees and different amounts depending on the composition of the microbes and when they are interacting with the molecules in the actual substrate, right? Now, a couple different points here. I think there's been a lot of, honestly, for a really good long while, I was really skeptical about kombucha. I was like, okay, it's just whatever, it's there, just a drink. The bacteria aren't killing you or whatever. But it does seem that there are some emerging benefits that are associated with kombucha. We're going to talk about one in a second. But what's really cool, I guess the main point that we're making here is that the bacteria and the microbes that are present in kombucha, as long as you're preparing them correctly and you're not accidentally poisoning yourself, the microorganisms that are present in kombucha are pretty good when it comes to colonizing your gut, right? So if you want to colonize your gut, say after you've had some kind of antibiotic or whatever, and your gut microbiome is just wiped, right? A good way of colonizing your gut would be something like kombucha, because it's composed of bacteria and yeast that aren't going to try and murder you, at least initially, right? So point number 4, kombucha can be used as a way of positively colonizing your gut, right? Now, there are some benefits I think that people claim to kombucha that I don't necessarily know are true, or I'm still turning them around and learning more about it. But in general, it's a good way of colonizing your gut. Now, what the researchers over at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in North Carolina, what they were doing is they were thinking to themselves, okay, so we have ourselves some beautiful kombucha microorganisms. We had this yeast and bacteria, and specifically the bacteria was the most important here. And so what they did is, what happens if we take that series of microorganisms and we give it to a model organism like C. elegans, right? Now, C. elegans, for those of you guys who don't know, is a type of nematode. It's a type of really, really tiny worm that you can see under a microscope, right? And they're really useful as model organisms. Oftentimes they're used in studies looking at developmental biology and things like this. But what these guys were doing, not the worms, but the researchers, what they were doing is they took these kombucha microbes, right, and they gave them to these C. elegans nematode worms, right? And then they compared the metabolism of those worms that were subsisting on kombucha microbes to nematodes that were growing on non-kombucha based microbes. And what they found was really, really weird. They realized that if you looked at the lipid metabolism of these two different types of nematodes, right, the ones that were on kombucha were not developing anywhere near as many fatty deposits as the ones that were subsisting on non-kombucha based microbes, right? There was less free lipids floating around. Lipid synthesis was going down in the case of the kombucha base. In general, it was mimicking a lot of the benefits that you see when you're doing intermittent fasting, right? It was replicating the benefits that you see in intermittent fasting just by growing and consuming the bacteria that was present in kombucha. Absolutely wild. So point number 5, if these C. elegans worms consumed kombucha microbes, then they started to degrade lipids more and stop lipid synthesis, similar to the way that occurs in intermittent fasting. It's an absolutely wild, wild example of how, first of all, so many different things, but not the least is the fact that the bacteria that we consume, the microbes that we consume, can dictate the metabolism that we're doing, right? And you can harness that as a way of promoting some of these benefits that you can see in dieting, or at least in the case of C. elegans. So let's wrap this up. Let's put all this together. Point number 1, there are a whole bunch of diets that are out there that people try, one of which is intermittent fasting. Feel free to look into that one if you're looking for a diet to try. Point number 2, there's a whole bunch of benefits to intermittent fasting, ranging from the degree of insulin sensitivity to longevity to lipid metabolism, right? Point number 3, our gut microbiome influences and is influenced by our diet, right? There's a nice back and forth betwixt the diet and the gut microbiome. Number 4, kombucha, which is that tea-based drink that is set upon by different kinds of microbes. It can be used to positively colonize our gut, especially after like an antibiotic or something like this. And finally, point number 5, if C. elegans worms consume kombucha microbes, then they start degrading lipids and they stop synthesizing lipids in a similar way in intermittent fasting. It's a really, really cool paper. It's a really neat instance of how microbes can influence the metabolism that we do, and how we can use that as a way of gaining benefits from some of these diets that we're seeing. And hey, it might even be a reason to grab some kombucha at the store next time, or maybe even make your own, whatever the case may be. But anyway, that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope I will see you guys again next time on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey everyone, thanks for watching that video. If you guys enjoyed it, if you liked what you saw, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button, and I will hopefully see you guys in the next video. Later!